Alright, so for today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the past and find some inspiration for our web designs in perhaps an unlikely place. We're going to be looking at the iconic album artwork of Blue Note Records. Now, Blue Note Records, if you're unfamiliar, is a famous jazz label that was founded back in the late 30s, I believe, but they really hit their heyday in the 50s and 60s when bop came about. And one of the really interesting things about Blue Note is that while they created some of the most iconic pieces of music in the genre, they were almost equally as well known for their creative and bold album covers. If you were to flip over any record during that time, you were likely to find two names in the liner notes. Francis Wolff, who was one of the founders, I believe, who early on would take to photographing the recording sessions and just capturing those moments as the musicians came in to do their work. And then later on in the 50s, they brought on Reed Miles to help with graphic design and creating kind of a cohesive look and feel across all of their albums. So I thought it'd be a fun little exercise to look back at some of the pieces created by these guys and just see what we could glean from them. What can we take away from the typography, the layouts, the photography? How can we maybe break out of a creative rut that we find ourselves in our day-to-day web design world and take some of these ideas back into our work and make it stronger as a whole? Now, a quick note about these examples. Wolff and Reed did not necessarily photograph or design all of the pieces that you're seeing here. I picked them for various reasons to dive into different web design concepts, but those two are often considered the primary creative force behind a lot of their most classic works. So I just wanted to bring them up to give you all a little bit more context as we dive into these pieces. Now, before we start, there are a few foundational pieces that I want to talk about here. When I was thinking about doing this as a video series, there was a couple different ways I thought I could take it. The initial direction that I wanted to go was taking these pieces of album artwork as kind of a starting point for some inspiration and seeing how I could rework them as completely responsive modern web designs. So not just being stuck with kind of the traditional square album artwork format. However, as I thought about it a little bit more, I thought what would be more fun than that, and perhaps even a little bit more challenging, would be to take these designs and see if I could make them fully responsive in a way where they would maintain their format across all screen sizes. So I wanted to keep the traditional square aspect ratio and work on a design that would look great both on a big screen all the way down to the smallest of phones. So I knew that to make that happen, I was going to need to be really thinking about my font sizing from the ground up, because that's really going to be the foundational piece that we're going to use to relatively set all of our other dimensions and relationships between our layouts and text and get it working uniformly across all screen sizes. Now, you're likely familiar with the various font sizing techniques we have to work with typography in the browser. But there's a new CSS spec for a function called clamp, which basically is a superset of two additional functions called min and max that are going to be available as well. But you can basically think of the clamp function like this. We have our center value here where we're setting a unit that we want to use for our base sizing. So in this instance, I'm using 4 VW. So again, that's like saying 4% of the overall viewport width is what I'm using as my base font size. So the really cool thing about this is, in theory, we should get a font size that is highly dynamic based upon the size of the screen that's viewing it. So for really small screens, everything will shrink down accordingly, and then it will get larger for big screens. Now, the really cool thing about this clamp function that is really just going to change so many things for web design moving forward is that we can effectively set a minimum and a maximum value so that we can rein in this middle value here. So what this whole value is saying here is that effectively, I want my base font size for this entire page to change using this value, but once its computed value gets up to 48 pixels on a larger screen, I want it to stop there. I don't want it to keep growing and keep getting larger. And why this is important is because things like typography can, of course, continue to grow and they will scale and look fine as screens get larger. However, if I'm working with a photograph, that's a raster image, so it's pixel based. And if I just keep blowing that photo up bigger and bigger and bigger, at some point it's just going to look like absolute garbage. So we've got to be really careful when using these techniques as a foundation that we're working on. And then of course, in the other direction, we've got the 14 pixel floor, which just says it should never get smaller than this. So we can always have a predictable lower limit that we're working with. This function does not natively work in the tool as of yet. There's a few things we got to shuffle around to allow for this syntax to work within our inputs. And that is why, just for now, for this example, I'm using our page CSS editor to just add this to our design here. And you'll notice that I'm applying it to our discography element, which is our top level section that you see in the outline. Beyond that, for each of our albums over here, I've got a class that I added in the Customize Control tab. And while all of these properties can be easily managed from within those native options, just to make things a little more clean and predictable, I just added these styles on the page level CSS as well. So things like a simple box shadow, a border radius, making sure the overflow is hidden. Just adding all that here helped in kind of the foundational setup of this page. So I know that's quite a bit of setup for today, but I wanted to go through it because I wanted you to understand what's happening here as we start working through these designs responsively, because you're going to see that each of these examples that I'm working on is maintaining its proportions exactly as it works down to our smaller screens and then all the way back up to our largest screen size. So it's a very different kind of technique, somewhat experimental that I'm working with here, but a really important piece to the puzzle to make this all work the way that I wanted it to. All right, so now that we've got all that setup out of the way, let's talk about our first example. We've got Art Blakey's Moanin'. A personal all-time favorite, and from a design standpoint, just a classic. We've got the bold image happening over here, and then we've got a really unique column to the right-hand side here of all this typography. And it's something I had never really noticed until I sat down and was analyzing this design, but there are some kind of cardinal sins, if you will, happening related to the typography. Now, I want to start again with kind of the general setup that I'm using for all of these albums that I've created on this page here. If I go up to this base level element here, you'll see that we've got a row. And really all I'm doing here is I've added one column. We've removed all of our gap sizing because we're just using that one column layout. And then we've set a width on our row and then a max width here as well. Now, if I go one layer up to our discography section here really quick, you'll see that all we're really doing here is a simple background color, and we've got some padding on the top and bottom that we're working with. So nothing too crazy there. So if I click back in here and then go to the column inside of our row and then scroll down through the controls, really the only thing of note in here that you'll see is we've got a bottom padding of 100%. And this is just the old aspect ratio trick that if you've been in web design for any amount of time, you've likely seen at some point in the past. Basically, we're setting a bottom padding on this column of 100% so that we can maintain this 1-to-1 aspect ratio as our content sizes up and down. So if I keep digging into the element tree here and go to our div, that is the immediate child of our column, this is where we're really setting the canvas for us to work on here. So we've got two layers that we're working with here. We've got our wear and tear layer, which is another div, where we're doing some of the features over here that you're seeing that are just giving some kind of texture to our element. And then we've got our artwork layer, which is where we've set all of our photography, all of our grid layouts, all of the typography. That's where all of that is going to live for all of these album examples. Now, how we're positioning this div is we're going down here and setting it to be absolute, and then we're just aligning it to the four corners of that parent column. So that's how this element is spanning the entire size of that column, even though we were using a bottom padding value earlier. Because remember that if we use position absolute here, it takes this element outside of the document flow, which is what keeps that padding from pushing up into our artwork here, which obviously we don't want because that would ruin the 1-to-1 aspect ratio that we're trying to work with here. Finally, we've set the internal flexbox layout of that canvas div to a row orientation. And the key thing to take away here is that our vertical align value is set to stretch. And this is what is stretching the artwork element here, which is a grid across the vertical axis. So all of these layers are needed to kind of set the stage for us to begin working with this content in the way that we see fit. Now I'm going to come back to this wear and tear layer a little bit later, but let's keep going down the tree here, and we're going to start with our artwork grid element. So as I just mentioned, this grid element is of course being stretched vertically throughout the entire canvas here. due to the flexbox setting on that div. And this is really where we can start setting the stage for our design. And I knew that I was going to have to use the grid element to achieve these layouts because there's so much creative layering and things going on that there's really just no other way. And it's such a cool opportunity for us to really dive deep into the grid and do some creative things with it that we might not otherwise in our more traditional web layouts. Now for all these designs, since I maintained the 1-to-1 aspect ratio across all of our viewports, I wasn't doing any traditional shuffling of web elements. The layout that you're seeing over here for the grid element is the same for all of these breakpoints. So even though we could alter it at an individual level if we wanted to, since I was wanting to keep that 1-to-1 aspect ratio, we're just using the same value everywhere. So let's actually jump over into the live preview here, and let's just analyze what's happening. We'll open up our columns template pop-up here, and we'll see that we've got 3 columns here. We've got a 1FR value, which if you know from some of our previous videos on the grid, is really just a value that in this case is saying, hey, this column should fill all of this horizontal space that's available with whatever's left over. Then next, we have our 6M column, which is what you're seeing right here, which is housing all these lines of text. And really, I only set this value because I wanted to keep these text cells kind of situated to the right over here so that I could click anywhere to the left and quickly get to my artwork if I needed to. We could very easily eliminate this column and just use the 1FR value, but then anytime I hovered over here, I'd be inspecting those lines of text rather than getting through to that image whenever I needed it. So that was strictly a personal decision to make things a little bit easier on my end. And then finally, we've got this 0.25M value for our very final little bit of spacing over here. So you might be asking yourself, where are you getting all these values? Where is the reference? Well, I did use a reference image for all of these albums. Now, like a lot of the albums of that time, there were often numerous pressings of these records. Sometimes the format or sizing or color of various elements might have shifted for different pressings. So basically what I did is I went to Spotify and just grabbed what is kind of the most prevalent example available on there. So I would take each of these albums and I would just kind of analyze them and say, how would I approach this using the grid as my layout element? And then how would I translate that into my CSS values? So as I'm looking at this page, obviously we have our full width and height image here, which is just going to span the entire canvas. So nothing too crazy there. And we can see that for the grid, really all we need is some type of top buffer here to move all this text away from the top edge of the artwork, as well as a right buffer here so that we can push this text away from the right edge. And then of course, we're gonna need a grid line for each bit of text here for us to work on. So as far as our column layout is concerned, that's how we're getting these 3 values here. So next we have our rows template, which as we can see here, we have our top value of 0.75 ems, which is this tiny little bit pushing our text away from the top. And then we're using our repeat statement, which is super handy in a situation like this. Without this function, I would effectively be having to write this auto value 11 times over for these 11 individual lines of text that I need to work with. But the really great thing is the repeat function just simplifies all of that. And then finally, just a 1FR value that's effectively saying, hey, whatever isn't being taken up by that top gutter there and these 11 lines of text, just make sure that you fill out all of that remaining space towards the bottom. So that right there is the overall grid setup. Nothing too crazy. And again, it's just a matter of looking at our reference image and really getting a sense for how we want to tackle this. Next, we're just setting a base font size on our grid, which is going to serve as the foundation for any elements within it. So remember, we've got our clamp value that we've set globally up here, and then we're just relatively sizing off of that using our ems on this grid. All right, so let's talk about this image here first. As I click over here and then move over to the workspace, you'll see that there's no element here. And that's because for this particular situation, we're just using our advanced backgrounds with a background image on our lower layer. This is just an image that I found online that I was trying to get something in place to match what I was seeing from the reference. Now, obviously, the image I found that was big enough wasn't quite styled in the same way that our reference from Spotify was. So this is what kind of gave me my initial thought of really leaning into CSS filters, CSS blend modes, and seeing just how far I could take things in the browser as I worked on this design asset. So how are we getting this look exactly? Well, if I jump down to my cell's effects panel, you'll see that we've got a few things going on here. First, I've set the mix blend mode to multiply, which is very similar to using a multiply filter in Photoshop. It basically will take a color that you've set behind the element you're working on, and it essentially multiplies each pixel from the original image by the value of the color that you've set behind that image. So I'm really doing that just to alter the color of this asset a bit and kind of correct it so that it matches my reference a little bit more closely. Now that color that we're multiplying things by is up here on the grid. If I jump back down to my background color, you'll see that we've got this hex value in here. And you can see as I move this slider around that the appearance of the image over there is subtly changing its temperature as I move through this slider. And even more dramatically, as I go around on the spectrum up here, you can really see things shifting as we move through that. And really, most of this was just a trial and error process. I knew that I was probably going to be using that multiply filter. And so after I set that value, I came back here and worked with my color to continue that process of matching the asset I was working on to the reference image. Now, the next bit of CSS trickery that I'm doing on this image here is under my filters. And you'll notice that if we jump back to our reference image here, it's a pretty high contrast image and the brightness has been dimmed just a little bit. Jumping back over to our design, if I go to my cell's main options here and we kind of look at our original image, you'll see that it's much brighter and also the contrast has been brought down just a little bit. So I wanted to bring that back, even though I kind of liked this newer, more updated image a little bit more. My goal was to try and match the reference as closely as possible. So that is where the filters on this element come into play. And really all I'm doing here is just bumping up the contrast quite a bit, 199%. And that is, of course, what really makes the darks darker and the lights lighter. And then I'm dimming it overall just a little bit with my brightness filter here. And you can see just what a difference these two values make if I were to take them out here. I mean, what a change we get over in the live preview. And then additionally, if I were to jump down here and just set this back to normal. So now this is the completely original asset. So there's no blending, no filtering, nothing going on. And really just these two simple changes here allow us to get that much closer to our reference image directly in the browser. No Photoshop needed. Now, as for the general positioning of this cell, there's a really cool trick you can do with the grid spec when you need something to align to the far outer bounds of your grid. Instead of having to set an actual number like 4, which would be the value we use for our x-axis to get this to align towards the end, you can just put the number 1 in your starting input here and then -1 for your ending input. And this basically just says that you want this cell to stretch from the start to the end of the x-axis and from the start to the end of the y-axis. So that is a super helpful time-saving trick there in case you're ever working with really complicated grids or really just more involved grids. Even though this one is overall not super complicated, it can be easy to maybe lose count of where things are or just how far down you need to set a number or anything like that. So just a super helpful little time-saving trick there. All right, so now we get into the actual typography of the piece. And really when I'm looking for a matching font family to work with from Google Fonts, it's simply a matter of going to the source material, kind of getting a sense of what's going on here. So obviously we've got a slightly more condensed sans serif, and then I'm taking note of the various forms and what they're doing. What are the arcs doing in my S's, my J's? How do the stems work? How does the stroke perhaps differ on different parts of some of my glyphs? And then I'll take that information and try and go find the closest approximation I can locate. For this particular scenario, I think I ended up going with Oswald, which is not a perfect match, but it does get us really close. Some big differences that we obviously don't have are the smaller stroke on this side of the A. You can see over here that they're about the same width on this form. We've also got some very subtle differences on things like the two O's down here, where they've got a little bit more of a curve, whereas Oswald is a little more linear and then just kind of moves over. So These are not make or break type of differences to me. It's really very much so in the same ballpark as the original. Certainly for demonstration purposes, good enough for us to go on here. Now, if we hop back over to the reference piece here and really start picking apart what's going on with our typography, you might have already noticed the big typographic no-no that I alluded to earlier. There's kind of a general rule of thumb in typography that you don't stretch your fonts out on a single axis, so either horizontally or vertically, because what you ultimately end up doing is messing with the forms of the letters. However, if we really look at this piece, we'll see that there's no way that we can get this perfect alignment of all of our forms here on this left-hand side without altering the x-axis of our text in some way. If we look to the top where we've got our Art Blakey and then and the, each of these words appear to be relatively untouched to my eye. These are likely the base forms of the font used, and I think they look awesome. However, as we move down the line here to any of our four-letter words or syllables, you'll see that things are very clearly scrunched along that x-axis. And again, this is something that I just never really noticed all these years of staring at this album cover. I think in general, you're just kind of looking at the form of it all, and it feels really tight, really solid, and it's just not something that might hit you at first glance. So I thought this was a really fun detail, and I was curious to see how I could replicate it in our builders. And I ended up using a combination of letter spacing, but also the static transform property on our text. And I'm really just using that scale X function to either bring a syllable in or stretch it out just a little bit. So if we hop back over to our builder and we click on art, which I think I've already got selected, you'll see that we've got just a little bit of letter spacing here to give a little bit of air between the letters. I can click on Blakey and we'll see that it's about the same. I'm just going to kind of go down the line here. And you'll see that this is our first instance where we're just altering the letter spacing a tiny bit to bring that form in. Now, I don't believe on this line of text that I affected anything here. No, so that scaling is just set to 1. In fact, I could just go ahead and take that out. But let's just keep moving down the line here and see exactly what we did on each word. So here's our the. If we scroll down, we've got the same letter spacing as Art and Blakey. And then I would imagine, okay, so this got scaled out just a little bit. And if I take that out, you'll see that those base letters, even with the letter spacing, still didn't quite get us to the line that we're looking for on that left edge. Now, our next word, jazz, is where there was a real careful balance of trying to get the spacing between the letters just right, and then also the general scaling. You'll see that we've actually got more spacing than we had before on our normal words up top. But again, if we go back to the reference piece here, we can see that there's a fair amount of space between each of our letters here. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining that while also getting our transform correct. So you'll see if I remove this, the word pops out just a little bit too much. So we use our scale X function to bring that in. And really it was as simple as that. Looking at the reference material, getting a sense of the spacing not only between the letters, but also amongst the words themselves. And then just kind of through trial and error, trying to match things as closely as possible. And it was a really fun exercise in effectively breaking this rule that's kind of a cardinal sin in typography. Now, you might have already assumed this by looking at the form for a while now, but what all of this text ultimately adds up to is an abstract number 1. This album was essentially the first LP by this second or third formation of Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. So the general layout and form of these words is being used to allude to that first LP being produced. And this is what I was kind of talking about earlier. We have general rules that, of course, serve as a guideline for us to follow and make sure that we're kind of staying within our lane. But this is a really creative example of how we can break those rules and achieve something just a little more subtle, a little more sophisticated, with more depth and nuance overall. All right, so we've talked filters, we've talked grids, we've talked typography. Let's talk about some of the finishing touches that I added to this piece to really just give it that final bit of grit and tactile feel that I was looking for. The first thing that I want to talk about is this wear and tear layer that I added over the artwork to give it that sense of an aged vinyl sleeve, something where a well-loved record has just been sitting in that sleeve for years. So if I go up to my canvas layer here, and click back to my div. We'll go up here and see that we've got this wear and tear layer. Now, if I inspect this, you'll see that it's just a div. And what we've done with it is effectively used our absolute positioning, just like we did with our canvas from earlier, and we've stretched it out to the four corners of our column. If I jump back to the top here, you'll see that we've simply got this background image, which I basically just found online. I think I Googled for vinyl record textures or something like that. There's so many great free resources out there today. If you just give it a quick search, I'm sure you can find something very similar. But I've applied this image to go over my artwork. You'll see that I've got the z-index set to 2. And this is just a transparent ping with a little bit of texture there. So it's giving me that kind of grit and wear that I'm looking for. Now, one cool trick that I did with this is I used the no pointer events option for our div element. And this is a great scenario to use something like this. Since I've got the z-index set to 2, what should typically happen is that every time I move my mouse over this area, I'd be clicking on that wear and tear div over and over again. However, the primary focus of this piece is obviously the image and the text that I'm working with over here. So to make my workflow just a little bit more efficient, I've set the no pointer events value to all content. And this effectively means that even though that wear and tear div is above my image and my typography layer, I won't ever be able to click it over here in the live preview. And again, that might feel a little strange at first, but the reasoning is the primary focus of working with this piece is the content down here. And for the couple times I need to jump back and make a quick edit here, I can do so from the outline pane up in my main nav. Now, if I jump down to the effects module of our wear and tear layer, you'll see that there is quite a bit going on here. And I actually want to start at the bottom here with our mix blend mode. The first thing I've done is set this from normal over to a screen value. And this just really helps to kind of integrate that asset into the image below. Next, we're using just a little bit of opacity to kind of help it blend into the image, just a very tiny bit. And then if I open up my filters here, you'll see that we've got three things going on. A slight blur on this layer, and then we're also playing around with the contrast and the brightness. So if I take all of this away, you'll see that, at least to my eyes, it's a little too harsh, and it kind of feels like it's just sitting on top of the image rather than being part of this record sleeve as a whole. So the point of each of these elements is to kind of blur out the detail a little bit, just smooth it out some, rein in those lowlights and highlights, and then also just dim the brightness a very little bit. And to me, these small moves are the little things that really over time add up to a much more engaging end piece. Finally, all I did with this transform layer was rotate it a little bit and then scale it and skew it ever so slightly. And again, if I were to take this out, you'll see that orientation there. And really the only reason why I was playing with these values was due to the fact that I'm using this same grit texture on all three of the records on this page. So I wanted them to each appear slightly different and not just look like a patterned element over and over and over again on my page. Now, the last very subtle bit that I really think helps to bring this whole piece together is a very light global blur that I put over everything on the artwork here. So I can't remember where I put it, if it's on my canvas. No, I think it's on my artwork layer here. All right, so here we go. Now, what I'm doing here is, again, by looking at my reference piece, I'm just trying to take note of every little detail that's going on. And if you really look at the letters over there, you can see that, of course, we don't have these super crisp, sharp, digital-looking edges around those forms. Remember, this would have been printed on to a record sleeve, and perhaps you have just a subtle little bit of ink bleed, or maybe over time, there's just an aging process going on. And this is something I was struggling with for a bit because I didn't know how to get that kind of look and feel to translate over to this piece. But ultimately, what I ended up doing was applying this very tiny amount of blur to the whole piece here. Now, I have no idea if this is going to really translate in the video that you all are watching, but notice when I take this value away what happens. You can see that instantly the letters over here appear to be much more sharp. The edges are really defined, and it really just looks like web text just kind of sitting on top of an image. So the whole time I was working on this piece, I was really liking how all the elements were coming together, but it didn't feel like it was really glued together and felt real tactile to me. So when I finally played around with this and added this, again, very subtle value to the overall piece, what we end up getting is just a smoothing effect over everything. Even if you take a look at the picture itself, you can see that it's got a lot more detail coming through when I remove that value versus putting the blur back on. It just softens it ever so slightly. And the really cool thing about discovering this approach is that it ended up becoming a technique that I explored in some of the later pieces that we're going to be going through in this series.